Australia, a land famous for its strange wildlife. The continent's Oceania's dominating mammal life mostly consists of marsupials, which have evolved in strange ways. Lots of its marsupial wildlife underwent a bizarre amount of convergent evolution with placental mammals. The marten-like wolves, the lemur-like cuscuses, the flying squirrel-like whispering gliders, for example. Some of the more insane examples of marsupial convergent evolution, however, used to roam the wilds of Tasmania. Resembles Canis with a skull and has stripes like a tiger. The thylacine. The thylacine, also known as Tasmanian tiger or Tasmanian wolf, used to inhabit Tasmania's forests and grasslands. It hunted, among other things, bandicoots, Tasmanian native hen, wallabies, according to some, even kangaroos and the now extinct Tasmanian emu. The Thalacine's reign started to shatter in 1803, when Tasmania was colonized by the British. Soon after, sheep got introduced into Tasmania, where thylacines were said to be a threat to, resulting in a lot of people going out to hunt thylacines. It went so far that a bounty was put on their head. The last known thylacine kill was made in 1930 by a man named Wilf Beatty. The failed thylacines persisted in captivity, however. The last known thylacine died on 7 September 1936 at the Hobart Zoo due to being neglected, freezing to death. In 1982, the thylacine was declared extinct, which is accepted by most people. But are they really, though? Almost 90 years it has been quote-unquote extinct, a large number of the sightings of thylacines have been reported. Some of the evidence is bad, but some of it is pretty convincing. Let's start right away with two of the most convincing. Hans Harding woke up at 2 a.m. in his car. It was raining heavily outside, and out of habit, he grabbed his spotlight and started looking into his surroundings with it. After a few moments, the light, according to Harding, came to rest on a thylacine, sitting around an estimated 6 or 7 meters away from him. His camera was not in reach, so he decided to observe it carefully instead. He described it as a large, healthy adult male with 12 black stripes on a sandy-colored coat. The reflection of the flashlight in Thalacine's eyes glowed pale yellow. He said it only moved once, that being opening its jaws and showing its teeth. After a few minutes of observing the animal, he decided to grab his camera, the noise of which spooking the animal, and it moved into the underbrush. He then left the vehicle and went to where the animal disappeared, where he noticed a strong smell. This sighting took place in Tagari, and the witness, Hans Harding, is or was an experienced field ranger of the Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Department. This sighting was kept secret for 2 years, while an extensive search for the animal was carried out in a 250 square meter area. No evidence was found, however. That said, according to the Thylacine Museum, the official government report states, it was concluded that the search area was used irregularly by thylacines until Adam 1982, but use has diminished due to increased disturbance to the point that detection of animals is not probable, despite large efforts. The report even concludes with, unless the thylacine observed in March 1982 by the surface biologist was the last of the species, it must be accepted that thylacines survive in a number of areas of Tasmania. So what do I think of this sighting? Personally, I think it's genuine. Why? Let's start with the description of the animal. Of course the general build matches up. The 12 stripes is plausible, as individual thylacines seem to have stripe patterns, similar to that of a tiger. And of course, looking at taxidermy specimens and drawings of thylacines, their fur seems to be that of a sandy color. What I also find interesting is that thylacine opened its jaws, which is famous for being able to open incredibly wide. How far depends on the source, but generally 80 to 90 degrees. Thylacines in photographs and videos are often seen opening their mouth to these degrees. Why did the animal in this case open its mouth? That I can't say. The best my mind came up with is yawning. What also checks out is that thylacines were nocturnal, which connected to the Tapedium lucidum. And according to an article published in 1845, by Ernst William from Berkeley, the thylacine possessed this feature. Its freeing upon hurrying northing is also plausible, since apparently thylacines were shy animals. The fierce hunting would probably not have helped. I haven't seen any alternative theories for this sighting, and barely anything would match up. It could not have been a quoll or a canid, since it was described as having stripes. So I do not see a reason why this could be a misidentification. The real reason, however, why the sighting is so credible is that a ranger saw it, and would be able to recognize animals in the area. He literally identified the animal as a thylacine himself, for crying out loud. The report supporting the sighting makes it, of course, even more plausible. I'm not sure what the scent is, however, but considering this really could have been anything, I don't think it's a serious issue. I should also note that it seems like Mr. Nording did think the thylacine was extinct in the area when interviews in 2005. This being done, said there were 2 sightings, however. Charles Beasley was, according to the Thylacine Museum, a summer interpretive ranger of the Department of Environment and Land Management based at St. Helens on the east coast of Tasmania. And on 25th January 1995, he claimed to have seen a juvenile thylacine while birdwatching the Pianagana region. I read an article of the Sydney Morning Herald in which Beasley described the animal as half the size of a German Shepherd, having stripes over its body from about halfway down, and describing the tail as curved like a kangaroo's. He further said that it had a horrible sandy color. He described the events, the sighting, as that it sniffed the ground, lifted its head, and ran into the bush. The Thylacine Museum has a more detailed description. The thylacine being described as dirty brown in color with black stripes down its ribcage and about half the size of a full-grown Alsatian dog. It had a face like a Staffordshire Bull Terrier but more elongated. The animal stretched, turned and walked back into the dense scrub. The tail was heavy and somewhat like that of a kangaroo and was held in a gentle curve. The sighting lasted for about 2 minutes. Apparently was there around a quarter after 8 p.m. and was using an 8-40 power binoculars and was watching across a valley when he saw the animal on a ledge over 350 meters away. Again, what do I think of this? Well, it's definitely the weaker one of the 2. I mainly find the description of the head really weird, since the stuffy doesn't really look like a thylacine. To make matters worse, Nick Nudie of the Parks and Wildlife Department stated that Beasley was a seasonal and temporary ranger, and fairly inexperienced in identifying wildlife. He also questioned the possibility of him seeing the animal over 350 meters away. A search was also conducted, but considering I can barely find any info on it, apart from that it happened, I don't think it was that extensive. Personally, I'm not sure what to think. Now we're at it, both of these sightings took place in Tasmania, but that might not be the only place where thylacines are still lurking. Thylacine fossils have been found on both the mainland of Australia and Papua New Guinea, being estimated to have gone extinct around 3,000 years ago on the mainland, but I do not think it's really known for PNG. Starting with the mainland, there have been many reports from this area, including some pretty convincing ones. But like anything, we should start at the beginning. The presence of thylacines on the mainland of Australia is pretty well documented, not only from fossils, but from rock art as well. But they seem to have disappeared from the mainland between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago. It's commonly said that dingoes are the main driving force for thylacine extinction here, but I'm a bit skeptical on that. First of all, we know dingoes are descendants of domestic dogs. It's good to say domestic dogs arrived, and some were humans. Or they became more common. In fact, human populations were increasing at the time, and it's quite common to see where humans come, animals in the fossil record disappear in that area. Second, the dingo wouldn't explain the extinction of the Tasmanian devil and Tasmanian native hen on the mainland around that time. Dingoes live in groups as well, allowing them to hunt larger prey, like mainland emus and red kangaroos, not thylacines. In fact, the 2 lifestyles are completely different. It's also here where it's appropriate to mention the thylacine bite force debate. Some studies have supported an idea that thylacine's jaws were only strong enough to kill animals under 5 kilograms, which is weak for an animal around the size of a coyote, while other studies have concluded it not to be. If this measurement is correct, as well as the fact that thylacines were smaller than those of Tasmania, it throws the idea that the dingoes outcompeted thylacines completely out of the window. That being said, the presence of thylacines on the mainland has been argued to be in written history as well, even before its extinction. Argued somewhat by the Thylacine Museum and especially the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia. The Thylacine Museum mentions, in their turn sourcing a book called The Last Tasmanian Tiger, that in writings of some scientists in the early 19th century, at least 2 populations of thylacines on the mainland has been found, with 2 actual remains of mainland specimens. De Goa mentions a sighting of thylacine on the mainland in 1836, as well as Joseph Banks mentioning thylacines on a beach. Both sources mention that Dr. John Palmer Litchfield mentions thylacine as one of the animals in South Australia. Though it should be noted that even in colonial times, some have noted the thylacine's absence on the mainland. Interestingly, the YouTuber WildWorld, which got me interested in the thylacine in the first place, mentions the theory of thylacines being introduced from Tasmania to the mainland by humans. The Thylacine Museum mentions this as well, with some actual evidence in the form of a newspaper from 1868, which mentions a few animals were planned to be released in Victoria by the Acclimation Society of Victoria, the thylacine reportedly being one of them. My friend Calvin the Carnotaurus also told me he has read about a man named Simo Winsons from the same society releasing cougars into Australia, which will explain sightings of cougars in the country. Calvin also showed me this really interesting find in a book called Out of the Shadows by Tony Healy and Paul Kruper, and I think it speaks for itself. In addition, I found this drawing from an unknown artist which is painted circa 1850, and if you look closely, it calls the thylacine New South Wales wolf. Though, to be fair, Tasmania was a part of New South Wales for a while, but it was already independent when the drawing was made. But I think you're ready for some individual evidence by now. So let's take a look at the Doyle film. This footage was taken in 1973 by Gary and Liz Doyle in South Australia, and it shows an animal very similar to the thylacine running in a seemingly somewhat urban area. At first glance, the shape of the body, especially the tail, matches up. But if you dig deeper, more possible evidence towards the thylacine identity can be unearthed. First off, if you look closely in some shots, it seems to have stripes, and even a sandy or grey-like color, which obviously matches of a thylacine. But the best evidence lies in the heels of the animal, who seem to be lower down, much like that of a thylacine and unlike those of a canid. Though it is hard to spot. Dog breed that seems to resemble the animal in the video the most is a greyhound. However, the greyhound probably isn't the culprit. First off, greyhounds are pretty much famous for being fast runners, while the animal in the video doesn't seem to be that fast, accurate with historical descriptions. Though you could argue that it wasn't running at full speed. Second, greyhounds seem to lunge forward while running, which the animal in the video doesn't. And of course, the tail doesn't match that of any canid. I should mention that the way the animal runs isn't consistent with how thylacines are described when hunting. As the thylacine was an endurance predator, chasing its prey in a lazy trot until its prey was exhausted, and then the thylacine would kill it. However, the animal in the video probably wasn't hunting. The thylacines are known to have been shy animals, and the video seemed to have been filmed from a car, and another car seems to be driving in the area as well. This animal probably wasn't chasing something, but was probably fleeing. Also, I quickly want to address that the thylacine is a nocturnal and crepuscular animal that sometimes went out in the day as well. Most criticism I have seen of this video is that the video is too blurry to fully conclude what it is. It also seems like where Light Meets Dark contacted Liz Doyle to examine the original film, they declined. But the real still exists. But this video isn't the most obscure, so I'm going to go with another sighting on the mainland. In 1984, a man named Kevin Cameron was contacted to search for thylacines in Western Australia as a response to an amount of thylacine sightings in that area. After a few months of searching, Cameron had a few photographs of supposed thylacine digging. Cameron gave the photographs to a zoologist who goes by the name Athol Douglas. Douglas states, early in February 1985, Kevin Cameron, who lives in the Garraween in Western Australia, shot 5 pictures at me. He offered no comment, and his manner was almost aggressive. As I looked at the photographs, the identity of the animal was unmistakable. It was around the size of a dog, with dark burrs across the rump and a thick base that to its tail. I realized without a doubt that Kevin has found a Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, alive in the southwest of Western Australia. Dr. Ronald Strahan, former director of the Taronga Park Zoo, according to Douglas, concluded that they were authentic and could only be that of the thylacine. While looking at the photographs, I'm not sure what we are looking at. The first photo, I can legit barely see anything. A criticism to this photo was that the shadows in the second and third photo have moved, suggesting a great amount of time has passed. While the animal has not moved, resulting in speculation that the animal was dead, either freshly killed or a taxidermy specimen. At first glance, the extremely erect tail was strange, but thylacines are known to be able to erect their tails. Another criticism that the stripes don't match thylacines, even though the website Light Mizark concluded otherwise. I am someone who pretty much defends the idea of thylacines still being around, but even I am not sure what to think. I mean, look at it! Cameron also went silent after criticism went after his photos, the reason of which was apparently that he was upset the public implied he shot the animal. The theory that he shot the thylacine is unlikely, however. He has shown great admiration and respect for the creature, and strongly stood by the point the animal was not shot. An article on New Science even states he believed there to be a conspiracy around the animal because of mining leashes. Douglas, however, further believed that the thylacine mummy, known as the Mundabella thylacine carcass, found in the paleontological site known as Thylacine Hole in Western Australia, has been dated to be around 4,600 to 4,700 years old. It's actually months old. He found it unlikely that a carcass would be so well preserved in a cave at high amount of humidity and carnivorous beetles. He also speculated that it was placed there by humans because the limestone rubble the carcass was found on was a result of a recent rockfall. I'm pretty skeptical of the carcass being months old. The carcass also has something to do with the next sighting, which was reported by a scientist. Dr. S.J. Peramov was employed by the CSIRO, and during that expedition, he saw an animal a few miles past the Barongo River. He described the animal as the following. Its size was that of a medium-sized dog, and the body proportions were almost dog-like. It was uniformly grey-brown, with short hair, a strange tail, extremely wide at the base, seemed to be a continuation of the hindquarters. The hind leg was strongly marked with almost back vertical stripes. He also described the animal's way of running as an up and down movement, like it was drunk. He also said he was convinced that it was a thylacine after seeing an illustration of one. In addition, he mentions the Mundabella thylacine carcass. Okay, let's get straight to the point now. The sighting probably isn't general. First off, the way he describes the animal is off. The color he describes the animal as having is off, but maybe possible for thylacine to get, though I wouldn't count on that. The real big issue is the way that stripes are described. They were described as being on the hind legs, while instead they should be on the back. And the stripes were described as horizontal, while in reality they were vertical. Something curious is that I found a Wikipedia article about a Soviet and Australian entomologist named Sergei Jacques Peremoev, which passed away in 1967, while the Thylacine Museum claims he was interviewed by the Western Australian naturalist in 1968. Though to be fair, I did find the same story on the Internet Archive, which claims it was made in 1967. Now we're at the bunks, let's talk a bit about the Queensland tiger. The Queensland tiger is a cryptid from, well, Queensland, that similarly first reported in 1871 by Brinsley G. Sheridan, and while walking with his teenage son and their terrier, they encountered a striped cat-like animal around the size of a dingo, with yellow fur and black stripes. The dog then attacked the animal, and the two fought. At a certain point, Sheridan shot at the cryptid's head, causing it to bleed. The animal then leapt into a tree, jumping on the dog and then focusing on Sheridan. In response, the two fled. While more reports started to pop up, somewhere in the years between 1880 and 1884, one Carl Lumholtz spent time in Australia, studying the flora and fauna there. Because of that, he obviously came in contact with Aboriginals. And as he told in Among Cannibals, 1889, very interesting title, natives spoke about two large animals, both he believed were unknown to science. The names were Bungari and Yeri. Bungari was later found and is now appropriately named Umholtz tree kangaroo, Bandurlagus lomsunsi. Yeri, however, remains unidentified. Lumholtz apparently believed it was a marsupial variant of a cat, saying the following. It was thought to be around the size of a dingo, though its legs were shorter and a long tail. It is described by the blacks as having been very savage. They pursued it climbing into the trees, but the natives did not dare to follow it. And by gestures, they explained to me how at such times it would growl and bite their hands. Rocky retreats were its most favorite habitat, and its pinnacle food should be the brown variety of wallaby common in North Queensland shrubs. These two are the only accounts I'm going into for this video, since there are some more Carl Zucker mentions in the Stories of Prehistoric Survivors, 1985, which is a source of both stories. What's in the video? Well, people have suggested the Queensland tiger is a thylacine, which obviously is not. Why do people think this? Probably because they are both, presumably in Queensland tiger's case, marsupial predators in Australia, and they're both around the same size or, most notably, have stripes. The thought that Queensland tigers are thylacines sounds plausible at first, until it doesn't. There are three reasons why it isn't plausible. First off, the Queensland tiger is very clearly described as having a cat-like face. Second, thylacines are arboreal, unlike the Queensland tiger. And finally, thylacines seem to be more shy than aggressive, unlike the Queensland tiger, which is willing to fight. A cool anti-Leonid identity has also been proposed for the Queensland tiger, which I agree more with. It has been proposed that the Queensland tiger is some sort of short-faced thylacine, which is fair, but I think it's a bit of a stretch. The thylacine identity seems to be solely based on the stripes. Anyway, the Queensland tiger will probably get a video for itself. Finally, Papua New Guinea is the last place surviving thylacines could hide. First off, we know thylacines lived here. In an archaeological expedition in 1960, the half of a thylacine mandible was found. According to Carl Zucker, a grazier named Ned Terry went to the little explored highlands of western New Guinea in the early 1990s, where natives told him about an animal named the Dobsekna, which Ned describes as the following in a Garuda article. The locals rarely saw the animal in full daylight. Usually it was seen hunting at dawn or dusk for small marsupials and birds. The people said they were very afraid of it because they associate it with evil spirits and use its feces to perform magic on enemies. They said its dens were usually in rocks or caves and described its head and shoulders as being like those of a dog, except it had a huge, strong mouth and a long, thin tail almost as long as its body. From the ribs to the hips, they said there were no intestines, indicating it was very thin there. And in that area, it had stripes. I do not think the no intestinal things is a problem, since thylacines were very skinny, and it could also imply they didn't kill it very often. As well as the association with evil spirits, since animals are very often associated with things they are not in mythology. Let's just look at bad cats. And again, they probably didn't kill it often if this is the case. The animal also doesn't seem to match anything else, so I think this is probably a fallacy, but it's from the actual wilderness or a cultural memory. And finally, we have a relatively recently sparked discussion surrounding the evidence of Forrest Galante. According to Galante, he was collecting data in a museum in New Guinea in the time of COVID, where he met a guy who was going to climb a mountain. The name of the mountain wasn't spoken because Galante didn't want to give away the area in western New Papua. And Galante asked him to do an experiment for him, on which he agreed. In return, Galante printed out 10 different photos of separate animals, 5 of which live in PNG, and I printed out 4 photos of non-native animals, but ones that could be confused with the ones there. And then the last photograph was that of a thylacine. It should be noted he printed all images black and white and in the quote-unquote same style. And he then asked the guy who was going to climb the mountain to, at a certain point, ask the guides which of the animals he had seen. And they said they had seen 6 of those animals, including all PNG ones, and of course, the thylacine, with none of them pointing to the wrong animals. The 5 PNG animals being seen pretty often, but the quote-unquote striped dogs being sighted only occasionally. Later on in the video, he talks about the most controversial aspect of the video. Galante reportedly got in touch with a woman named Rose, on the same university he was collecting sightings at. This is also where the New Guinea singing dog gets mentioned, which, I should note, was rediscovered in 2016 after being thought to be extinct in the wild for 50 years. But should also be noticed that these dogs are highly inbred, but I'm not sure if it really matters. Anyways, Galante asked Rose to do the same experiment like what he did with the man who climbed the mountain, to which she agreed. Rose would go to villages in Papua, looking for purebred singing dogs, where she would show the images. And after a while, she would message Galante that a man in a village owned a striped dog. And after a few months, he would finally get an update on the case, in which Rose told him that the man who owned the striped dog said that he found 2 of them in a hollow log, and took them with him. One of them died pretty fast, the second one he erased. He apparently described it as striped, that it had different hind legs and that it ran differently, assumingly comparing to a dog. But unfortunately, when Rose got to the village, a dog had killed it. To make the case worse, after the thylacine was killed, the villagers decided to cook and eat the thylacine and discarded the bones. Rose later found the bones, and they were basically unrecognizable as thylacine bones, except for one, the lower jaw, which she photographed and sent to Galante, and it matched the look of a thylacine jaw perfectly. Sadly, Rose didn't take the bone with her. Where does the controversy start? Well, Galante suspiciously decided to not show the image, instead showing an image of an old thylacine jawbone with the text, "The actual picture is being safeguarded by a variety of trusted experts at this time." Understandably, this made many people suspicious, since it's, well, just a picture. Galante, later on in the video, also seems to be begging for money so he can lead an expedition to the area, which is pretty suspicious.
Now, sadly, in order to do this expedition right, I have to raise close to $5 million. We need helicopters. We have to go to this incredibly remote area.
To make matters worse, Galante is known to be a bit of a suspicious figure, as he claimed to have rediscovered multiple animals, like the Fernida Island tortoise and the Rio Aporis caiman, while both reptiles were rediscovered by someone else. Galante, in his show Extinct or Alive, reportedly also found the Zanzibar leopard. This is also a bit of a debate. Personally, I take this report with a barrel of salt. That he doesn't even show the photograph of the jaw is enough for me. YouTuber Trady Explainer tried to contact him, which resulted in drama, and Galante blocked him on Twitter. Especially considering the really infamous oopsie he made recently, in which he interviewed a guy who reportedly saw a thylacine and took these pictures. To say, they were relatively easily debunked. He also makes a few errors throughout the video, mainly him claiming dingoes aren't native somehow. On a final note, an interview with Wildlife with Cookie in 2021, Galante tells about the same story. That's basically it for non-Tasmanian sightings for this video. Just mentioned there are some thylacine sightings outside of Oceania, but personally, I consider them to be their own cryptids. Anyway, back to Tasmania. It's about time I mention Magnificent Survivor. It's an online book written by an environmental scientist, which is known as Tiger Man. And the book, whose full name is Magnificent Survivor, can tell the existence of the Tasmanian tiger, has one goal: not to prove that thylacine still exists, but how to conserve it. She thinks it's definitely still alive. Tiger Man himself also claimed to have seen 2 thylacines himself, but prior to that he searched for months and months in the Tasmanian wilderness. For a long time, he didn't find any evidence of the animal. Convinced with the excessive search for the animal, he fell into depression. Resulted in him scripting a feature-length film about the Thylacine, but in what I believe was May 2002, he was taking a muddy area near a forest logging track. Just usual wombat and Tasmanian devil footprints. He climbed back into his car to repeat his usual strategy: to scare animals the speed of his car so they would show themselves. After a few hundred meters, he saw an animal on the track. It appeared to be chocolate brown, with some golden shades, and it was sniffing the ground. At the moment, Tiger Man didn't know what it was, so he decided to speed up to get a closer look at it, which resulted in the animal fleeing, which was when he clearly saw the unmistakable Thylacine shape and, according to Tiger Man, the matching running style. It amazed him not seeing stripes, which he defends with the Thylacine in high rainfall areas apparently had darker fur, and that it went too fast to see the stripes anyway. The next afternoon, he went back to the same spot, ready to wait for the animal to return. At around 5 p.m., he spread chicken and cat food on the track. After doing the job, he went to wash his hands in a creek. When he returned, he spotted an adult Thylacine around 150 meters away from him. He described it as looking like a panther and being around the same size. It was larger than the juvenile we saw before, and it was seemingly unaware of him. Its way of movement, Tiger Man described as creepy, flowing, and robotic. For the rest, it was given basically the same description as the juvenile before. So my thoughts? I now think they're more likely than when I first read them. There are still some criticism I would like to make. What is meant with panther? The word panther is mainly used for cougars and leopards, especially melanistic leopards. Though I have heard anything in Panthera can be called a panther, and I assume Pantheraceae, if any member of Pantheraceae can be called a panther, the only ones you can get in similar size to Thylacines are clouded leopards. And I find the description of the movement of the adult a bit weird. It also seems the description is a bit inconsistent, since he apparently said the animal in the Doyle film moved the same way as the Thylacine in his sighting, though his sketches say otherwise. Apart from that, they are fine, but should be taken with a grain of salt. But this Magnificent Survivor has more pieces of evidence, however. First off, a footprint of the juvenile. The print doesn't match the foot of a Thylacine really well, but to be fair, we have to consider height and front legs, and that footprints kind of fade sometimes, but yeah, that could also mean it's from another animal. Another one are images of a few dead sheep and one dead wallaby, probably a petamelon. The images obviously will not be shown, which I can't conclude anything on because the Thylacine way of eating varies from source to source. Something I would also like to note is that the book seems to go a bit into detail. Yeah, it is possible he went into the books to research the Thylacine, but sometimes say stuff about Thylacines in the modern day. And regarding its sound, it seems to be in conflict with historical information about it sounding like a yip. As he heard a call once, he thinks was made by the Thylacine, which was a coughing sounds, which Thylacines were also known to make. The next sighting is definitely something of interest. It happened on an unspecified date in 1971. A reliable and experienced hunter was hunting deer in eastern Tasmania. At 4:20 p.m., he climbed over a clump of wattles near a group of deer when an animal shot out near him, its head slightly touching the barrel of his firearm. It ran towards the deer, which started to run away. At a certain moment, a male intervened and lashed out at the animal, which started to run away, to which it was visible for about 150 meters until it ran into the forest. The hunter described the animal's build as being a cross between a corgi and a kelpie, which I find an odd description, mainly because of the short legs of a corgi, but isn't very descriptive, so I'll let it slide. The running description is something that might sound odd at first, because it was described as sawing and the backbone making a seesaw-like movement. But using the doll film as reference, it kinda matches up. It was also described as not very fast, which adds up with historical accounts. For the rest, he described it as being 18 inches, around 45 centimeters at the shoulder, which, according to the most reliable source on the internet, Wikipedia, is actually a bit small because it apparently should be 60 centimeters. The animal in the sighting was described as being of a sandy color, apart from some dark brown stripes on the back, which were about 1.5 inches, about 38 centimeters, which disappeared to third down the side of the animal, which sounds good to me. The hunter was apparently convinced thousands were extinct, so that it was a deformed dog or even some sort of cross between a dog and a Tasmanian devil. And you will think an experienced hunter would know the zoo cannot breed. And he was apparently only convinced he saw thylacine after seeing a taxidermy thylacine in a museum. Now I get to the elephant in the room. The animal touching the barrel of the gun. At first reading the story, it sounds like a major red flag. But is it really? I mean, the animal might have been focused on the deer, and it really depends on how much the animal touched the barrel. Something else of note is that the hunter is unspecified, which is a bit suspicious. As far as I'm concerned, it comes from one source. I tried to look up the original Australian Deer volume it was published in, but the closest what I found was the website of the Australian Deer, in which volume 2 from the 70s is mentioned alongside other volumes from the same time period. So that may solve it, but they were in 1967 and focused mainly on sample research. Though you could argue the Dulles sighting was reported later and the value also consists of other things. But I did search for thylacine and tiger on the website with no results. I did read the study the Thylacine Museum got the story from, where, yes, the story is present, but nothing in relation to Australian deer. So I think it was a thylacine. It could use more confirmation about the original story, but aside from that, yeah, it could have been. So far, we have basically only talked about sightings. But what about physical evidence? Well, I kind of have that. The story is a bit hard to play since we have two accounts. One of them involves a group of hunters hunting wallaby in the Adamsfield area when an animal resting startled them, which resulted in them impulsively shooting and killing the animal, only to discover the animal's identity. The other account is from a man called Rusty. At the moment it happened, Rusty was near an unspecified lake in the southwest of Tasmania, where an English couple told him they had seen a dingo. Knowing there are no dingoes in Tasmania, he assumed they had seen a dog of some sort. He did look around and found some scuff marks. He went up the rocky outcrops and came across a den with bones around it. And there was the body of a small deceased thylacine, of which he took photographs. Interestingly, he didn't take the picture of the full body, but did it in parts. And these are the pictures. At first, they obviously show a thylacine foot. I don't see it being any other animal really. The wound on the animal's paw looks fresh, and yeah, it seems to really match up. Or does it? In February of 2018, a reader of the website Where Light Meets Dark pointed out that the animal in the photographs resembled a specimen seen in a video the Australian Rare Fauna Research Association in the collection of Museum Victoria, and I don't know which museum specifically. The specimen, named C3149, seems to have the same wound on one of its legs as the animal in the photographs. So well, there goes the fresh wound. But is the Adamsfield thylacine now debunked? Simply, no. This can be stated by the simple fact that there is another photograph visible in one of the photographs. It's hard to make many details out of it, but for me it's obviously a thylacine foot. The toes match, and it seems to continue further under, let's call, the center of the paw. Something that really only matches a fallacy. And many speculate that C3149 specimen was there to compare it with the photographs. And most notably, it seems to be lying on grass. Some people apparently even see gum leaves in it, though I personally don't see them. Now there are two possibilities. Either there is a wild dead thylacine lying on the grass, or someone laid a museum specimen on the ground outside. But really, what is more plausible? Because, well, first off, someone had to take this highly valuable specimen from a museum and then expose it to the risk of damage by laying it on the ground outside. I should also note that it may be a prop, but the person who made it should have had a good knowledge on the Thylacine foot, and mainly there is no evidence to suggest that. But why wasn't the rest of the body photographs? Well, apparently it was. A former newspaper editor named Colin Comber was apparently shown the images. It's too much to write down here, but I was pretty pleasantly surprised when it was stated that the tail didn't have stripes apart from one at the beginning, since it's actually true. The stripes on the tail you see on some images are actually tricks of the light. Remain skeptical of this though, since it's basically just a story and nothing else. But still, what about the two separate stories? Well, it's time to make it even more confusing. In an interview with a man named Andron Richards Rusty, um, Rusty said he actually shot the animal. So, was Rusty lying when he said he found it? And was he actually the hunter who shot the animal? Well, I can't conclude on that. And I can understand why one would remain skeptical of this incident. I'm also a bit skeptical simply for this reason. I also wonder if it's possible that C3149 actually entered the collection later on, especially considering its label states there is no data on its origin. I would say it's unlikely because the museum would probably have taken track of such a specimen. And on the final subject of this section, I would like to talk about the Thylacine Group of Australia, or TAGOA for short. TAGOA, founded by Neil Waters, is an organization, for lack of a better term, which is in favor of the thylacine still existing, and their entire channel and website is built on reports of thylacines, the occasional Thylacoleo or big cat. To be fair, they do report on sightings from the mainland, but they do also report sightings from Tasmania, so I count them under this section. That being said, TAGOA is a questionable group. Apart from me hearing they get annoyed if you criticize their evidence, the evidence can be a pretty mixed bag. Some of it looks decent, some of it looks iffy, some of it looks like misidentification, and some of it looks like straight up hoaxes. So I advise you to be cautious when using their evidence, but they are not downright proven to be hoaxers. So this is your brief warning. Yes, I did use them as a source before, but that was alongside another source, which seems to be 4 days added. To make it very obvious, I'm more on the side of the debate that advocates for its survival, and this is quite a hot take. Before countering some arguments, I would like to go after the habitat of the thylacine, because Tasmania seems to have pretty large patches of land without large amounts of roads. And from messing around on Google Maps, it seems that a lot of roads are in nature, and we know that thylacines had fixed territories when found and mate, and even when persecuted, would rarely leave them. The main area that is pretty roadless lies in the southwest, and using the same technique on mainland Australia and PNG, well. Also, in some conversations, I've heard Tasmania being called tiny, when it's actually the size of something like Ireland or Switzerland. Take this subsection with a grain of salt, because I might be talking about something I have no clue about. So, if someone watching is Tasmanian, please help me out on this. I think I should also mention the study from 1981 named The Tasmanian Tiger 1980, a report on investigation of the current status of the Thylacine, Thylacine cynocephalus, by Stephen Smith, which was the oldest sighting I could find on the deer hunter sighting from 1971, claims that most sightings happen in more uninhabited places. And if the Thylacine was extinct, would expect sightings would happen closer to urban areas. Now I'll get to the meat and potatoes. I tried to counter some counter arguments. First off, misidentification. I've seen three types of animals being used as possible candidates: canids, quolls, and, quite bizarrely in my opinion, wallabies. But to counter the most common one first, the canids. And on paper, it sounds pretty reasonable. The two are known to be one of the best examples of convergent evolution. Serve very similar niches in the lifestyle of some canids overlap with that of the Thylacine. The canid argument often goes further with saying the canids misidentified as thylacines have mange, which makes them lose a lot of hair that resembles the thin and haired and slender thylacine. Do I think this is much of an issue? No. Let me explain. There are three canids that commonly get pointed to when discussing Thalassian sightings: dingo, domestic dog, and most commonly, red fox. I'll first go to an argument one might try to make a point with. Dingoes and dogs sometimes have stripes. Even though I've only heard this argument once, this can easily be discredited. To start off, you can't use dingoes for Tasmanian sightings since you don't live there. Second, all striped dingoes and dogs I have seen, both online and in real life, have stripes that match those of an actual tiger more than at the Thylacine. Those long and all over the body stripes. A far cry from the Thalacine's comparable short stripes on the back, which, yes, many witnesses describe them as such. Now I'm going to tackle the mange theory, and the canid idea in general. In the case of foxes and dingoes, the fluffy tail obviously is a major flaw, which the mange theory might take care of. Even with mangy foxes, which is the species most often used, a tail still becomes a flaw. The tails of foxes with mange are still somewhat flexible and very thin. Quite a bit of witnesses describe the tail of the animal they sighted as being very stiff and very thick at the butt, and becoming thinner the further away from the base. Something Thylacines have and canids don't. Even a darn Doyle film seems to have both of these features. Do I think some sightings are of canids? Yes. I've seen some on the internet who seem to be canids with mange. But this isn't the whole in the Thylacine sightings as often claimed. Also, I've also heard mange isn't as common as naysayers might make you think, but I don't know if that's true. The following animals are quolls, and I would say that a quoll perhaps resembles a thylacine more in silhouette than a canid. Even though the tail matches more hair, it also falls apart. Many sightings obviously describe something striped, which is something no quoll species has. They all have spots. The size is often described as the size of a medium-sized dog. The largest quoll species is a tiger quoll, still way too small. Finally, wallabies. I don't even know what to say. This is not something you would mistake a quadrupedal, striped dog-like predator for. So I want to briefly tackle the shadows create stripes argument. A lot of sightings have the animal moving or even running. The shadows would obviously not stay in the same place. An argument I have heard Wildport make is that the Thylacine was already in decline before Europeans arrived. I think this is based on its low genetic diversity. This is a study in 2012 by Braden R. Menzies, Marlon B. Renfrey, Thomas Hayter, Frieder Mayer, Thomas B. Heldrand, and Andrew J. Pask found that Thylacines had low genetic diversity, possibly due to graphical isolation. They analyzed 12 specimens and found that mitochondrial DNA were 99.91% identical with each other. Or that's what I understood, so I could be wrong. Nevertheless, the bottom line is that the Thylacine has very low genetic diversity. Well, the same applies to Tasmanian devils, which also have low genetic diversity, but that didn't stop their populations from increasing heavily after they were protected. The numbers were increasing so much that I have seen this good old study where I keep returning to claim that in some areas they were reaching pest proportions. In addition, there are sources from the 19th century who claim Thylacine populations were increasing. I do not fully trust these claims, but it's certainly something that should be mentioned. So, why haven't we found a body yet? It's quite simple to answer. One word. Devils. Again. The Tasmanian devil seems to be much more of a scavenger than the Thylacine. In fact, devils seem to have followed the Thylacine around to scavenge their kills. Combining this with devils going on feeding frenzies when multiple devils find a corpse to feed on, it can be assumed they might help the Thylacine stay undiscovered. And even though they are endangered, devils are still widespread and relatively numerous. And before the outbreak of the awful devil facial tumor disease, their numbers were, as said before, skyrocketing. And no, this isn't much of an argument whether Thylacine can still be alive, since there have been no reports of Thylacines attacking devils. On the flip side, you could say what else would be controlling our populations, and then you could say that very few individuals would couldn't control. And then you could say prey species aren't increasing, so this is a bit difficult to completely judge. And for the record, in case anyone would try to make a point of this, there have been many possible footprints found. For feces, I don't really know, but what I do know is that possible Thylacine feces have been found. Next up is ecology. Is the Thylacine's niche gone in Tasmania's wilds now? Well, maybe. For that, I checked the IUCN page of the prey species of the thylacine. The populations of the Tasmanian pademelon is stable. The population trends of the Tasmanian native hen and Tasmanian batong are unknown, and the eastern barred bandicoot is decreasing. Using species from the mainland as well, the populations of the red-necked wallaby, eastern grey kangaroo, common wombat, short-beaked echidna, and black swan should be remembered the latter has an especially large range, are all stable, and the long-nosed potteroo is decreasing. You should keep in mind the latter are also on the mainland where dingoes control the population. The only other thing we could control the populations on Tasmania are humans. And they do seem to maybe do it. As in this article commenting on the exploitations of wallabies and kangaroos in Tasmania, the wombat, however, was at the time of the article's writing not massively hunted. And the wombat was last assigned to the IUCN in 2016. Also, why haven't foxes been able to spread on Tasmania? This theory was put forward by my friend Aldate Megalosaur. A simple fact is that there have been many attempts to introduce foxes onto Tasmania, but foxes never really were able to spread on Tasmania, possibly due to a predator, ancestor, or a competitor. And this is where the thylacine comes into the story. Yes, this might be a bit of tinfoil hat, but I think it's worth thinking about. Relating to this, both feral dogs and foxes are rare on Tasmania, and dingoes are not present there. This again could suggest that identification is unlikely. Another argument surrounds the expeditions, and they say all expeditions haven't found anything. And guess what? They actually have. The second search for the thylacine ever conducted in November 1937, found tracks of thylacines and tracks of fleeing kangaroos and wallabies. The third search ever conducted, which took place in November 1938, also found a bunch of thylacine tracks. Of some plaster casts were obtained, which are currently in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, which makes me wonder why the 1936 date is so commonly accepted. I did find a pretty low quality image of the casts, which I found through my own research using the thylacine, Tasmanian devil, tiger crow, and a wombat for reference. Concluded that they were from either a thylacine or a devil. I also have sent out an email to the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery about the tracks, but so far they haven't replied. A search conducted by David Flea, an Australian scientist mostly known for being the first to put a platypus in captivity, and apparently also the one who filmed this famous route of the Thylacine, almost got one in a search carried out shortly after World War II, in which one was attracted by a wallaby used as bait, but as it entered the trap, in a panic mode, it broke free from its prison. And in many searches conducted by Eric Geiler, he found the Thylacine footprint at least once in the 1950s, to name a few. And now what you really want me to talk about. The 5 or 6 year long search conducted by Jeremy Griffith, James Melley, and Robert Brown. Mr. Griffith started the search in 1967 alongside his dog Lo, exploring Tasmania's west. In March 1968, James Melley joined the search. They searched around White River, Balfour Plains, northwest of Pieman River, Mortis Valley, and a few other places, including the area where David Fleet conducted his search. And finally, in 1972, Robert Brown would join the search. They not only just established camera traps, set traps and such, but also went to areas where sightings had occurred as fast as possible. At the end of the search, Griffith and Brown concluded it was extinct. However, Molly stated, "The tiger is not extinct. The only evidence I can produce to back up this claim is 20 photographs of this indistinct footprints found after the sighting of a tiger in Belay in May 1971. These tracks were definitely those of a tiger. However, they were not distinct enough from anyone who was not thoroughly familiar with animal past to recognize them as such. A plaster cast at Mambuana in August 1961 is definitely that of a tiger. In recent years, many clear sightings have been made by people who I know personally. I have no doubts of any sort in their sincerity and honesty. The majority of recent sightings have been in three areas of the state: the central east coast, the northern part of the Afar River Basin, and the northern edge of the Central Plateau. So, is this source conclusive? No, not at all. Even Griffin himself stated in 1972, having been in every likely corner of Tasmania, we appreciate how elusive a few thylacines could be in that country. That we haven't found any conclusive evidence of thylacines does not necessarily indicate that they are extinct. Rather, it illustrates the enormity of our task. We are powerless to help thylacines unless we can find them and assess their predicament. The alternative is that an uncertain case of extinction will become certain. In addition, I'm not sure if they just travel to certain areas they went to or just search every area on their path. But I'm going to say probably the first for the simple reason that searching through everything in your path would probably cost a lot of money. Also, I think there is something I need to address. I do not necessarily think the thylacine is still alive today, uh, in at this very moment. What I do think, however, is that it at least went extinct much more recently than commonly accepted, as it has to be known that most credible sightings are decades old. In a way, these results pretty much agree with a study conducted in 2023 by Barry Week Brook, Stephen R. Slanter, Cameron R. Campbell, Ivan Jarek, and Jesse C. Battle, which found that the extinction of the Thylacine most likely occurred in the late 1980s to early 2000s. And around the time, fox sightings in Tasmania became more frequent. Coincidence? If you would ask me what the best argument is for thylacine being extinct, I would say camera traps. If the thylacine were to be rediscovered, it's probably with this method. Prior to 2022, this wasn't much of a big deal, since to my knowledge there weren't many camera traps deployed in Tasmanian bush. But in 2023, researchers at the University of Tasmania deployed a network of 600 camera traps in Tasmanian bush. They managed to get 750,000 pictures of 150 different animal species. And I have to say that this probably was our best chance to rediscover the thylacine to this very day. Though I have to say, is it possible that thylacine avoid these camera traps? Yeah, it is possible, but is it plausible? Well, I first want to know where exactly the cameras were placed. That can help. And considering how many pictures were taken, I won't be surprised that they didn't look through all of them, and it seems that they haven't. And at the time the article was written, they were developing an animal detection and classification tool capable of identifying different species of wildlife. We don't know if it's completed now or not. Of course, we have to look a bit at some debates I personally had. Something you very often hear is it's 100% extinct, or it went extinct in 1936, or something like that, without any follow up. I think we all know these aren't arguments. I once even got DM'd on Discord by someone posting a screenshot of the IUCN page of the Thylacine. They would like to argue that when the IUCN declared the Thylacine extinct, the 50-year rule was still in place. After that, it was blindly accepted, it seems. And finally, the main reasons why Thylacines may stay on the shoulder for so long is that they are shy and they are mostly nocturnal. In fact, most Thylacines were caught in snares. They were rarely actually seen. Considering the most trap-shy individuals would have survived, they would have set behavior to the young. So, could it still exist? This is something I feel with cryptozoology in general sometimes. Yes, it has many absurd and scientifically implausible cryptids and theories, but some of them are plausible, which make me at least doubt the validities of cryptozoology's labeling as a pseudoscience. Let me get this straight. The Earth is round, we land on the moon, evolution is pretty much real, and so is COVID. Pretty obvious that I have to say this. But for cryptozoology, this may not be so easy. The section isn't for you to be convinced into thinking there are still thousands out there, so recognize that chances are much more even.
joke will never win. Well, look at me, I'm coming back again. I got a taste of love in a simple way. And if you need to know while I'm still standing, you just fade away. Don't you know I'm still standing better than I ever did? Looking like a true survivor, feeling like a little kid. And I'm still standing after all this time, picking up the pieces.